Yeah, Ngobese, xikolo senda kushandisa ipafoni.
Good morning, colleagues.
Morning.
How are you doing today?
I am well, thanks. How are you?
I'm okay. Can I just get, since it's just the four of us for now, can we get maybe your introductions, where you guys are from, which institutions, and what kind of research you guys are doing? We're not going to do this for everyone, but while we are waiting, we can get to know each other. I think it's a good thing.
No, that's fine. So my name is Dr. William Avengere. I'm based at the Hare Institute of Technology in Zimbabwe. So the research that I'm currently doing is on the development and commercialization of traditional medicines for the management of HIV. So it's a collaborative project that we're working on with researchers in Zimbabwe, Eswatini, and in South Africa.
Oh, that's great. Which institution are you working with in South Africa?
The CSIR.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's great. That's quite innovative. And we have another guest here. Can we have your introduction, Jonathan?
Good morning. Do you hear me?
Good morning.
Morning. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. You can go ahead.
Okay. My name is Jonathan Tawane from University of Mpumalanga, candidate of Masters. So my research project is all about the adoption of sustainable agricultural practices in Mbombela local municipality here at Mpumalanga. So I think this workshop will actually help me regarding to developing the brief of systematic review, which I'm currently busy with at the moment. So it's a survey study at the same time. So I'm collecting data around Mbombela, or sample size of 308 smallholder farmers. Thank you.
Okay. If I may ask, what practices are you looking at? Jonathan? Jonathan, are you still there?
I think I'm experiencing a network problem. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear Jonathan.
Okay.
It's back now. You did cut just a bit, but we can hear now.
Oh, is it audible now?
Yes.
Okay. I was saying I'm from University of Mpumalanga. So my studies, I'm a master's student candidate at the same time. So my research proposal or my research project is about the adoption of sustainable agricultural practices by legume smallholder farmers around the Mbombela local municipality. So in brief, I've got the sample size of 308 smallholder farmers, which I have to do interview with them, which is a face-to-face interview. So actually, the main important thing is to check if those farmers have the awareness or they are busy adopting those practices in their farm, so that they can be able to generate enough profit to increase crop yield at the same time. It's a cost-effective method. So by joining this workshop actually will help me, since I'm on a systematic review at the moment. It will help me to have that particular fast want to do going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I see we have another guest. Simba, can you please introduce yourself and the kind of research that you are doing? Just guys, we colleagues, we're not gonna, everyone is not, it's not gonna be everyone who will introduce themselves, but since we are now waiting for other colleagues to join, and just so that you are aware, most of the colleagues and students this side that are with me, they just told me they are experiencing some issues. But I think at 10 past we can start. Hopefully they will be able to join shortly. So Simba, you can introduce and also tell us what kind of research that you are doing.
Thank you, Dr. Miya. My name is Davidesani Simba. I am an entomology lecturer at Hare University. My research interest is ecosystem functions facilitated by insects. So I've worked in crop pollination, but so far I've been engrossed in dung beetle ecosystem functions. So the multiple ecosystem functions provided by dung beetles, be it in agricultural systems and natural systems. I am currently working on a systematic review myself, which is why I thought this would be a great platform for me to strengthen my my research. I am working on zoogenic methane emissions. So basically looking into all the research that has looked at methane emissions produced by animals, but also the influence of animals when it comes to methane emissions, whether it be increasing the methane emissions or decreasing the methane emissions in the different systems. So yes, that's my focus. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. I think we'll start now. I can see more people from Alice are now joining, so I'm hoping even our students will be sorted since they sent me a message. I'll start with the introduction of our facilitator. So we have Professor Nomali, Associate Professor Nomali Ngobese from Northwest University, the School of Geo and Spatial Sciences under the Faculty of Natural and Agricultural Sciences. Dr. Nomali is an Associate Professor in Northwest University, and she is a plant biologist by training. And she uses her expertise in plant physiology to optimize agronomic practices and optimize the yield and nutritional quality of food crops and underutilized plants. So her work is aimed at alleviating poverty and hunger and addressing Sustainable Development Goals number 1 and 2 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And she has an MSc in biology and a PhD in bioresources systems from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She is a registered professional natural scientist with the South African Council for Natural Scientific Professions, SACNASP, in botanical sciences and holds a Y rating with the National Research Foundation, NRF. She's currently a handling editor for the South African Journal of Botany. And before joining Northwest University, she was a deputy head of the Botany and Plant Biotechnology Department at the University of Joburg. Her achievements include leading the smallholder farmer development initiatives that earned the Northwest University the 2023 ACEEU EEE 4th Place Award for Community Engagement Initiative of the Year in Africa for the Climate Resilient and Responsible Innovation in Potato Crisp project. The Northwest University, Faculty of Natural and Agricultural Sciences, and the Unit for Environmental Sciences and Management's 2023 Award for Community Engagement and the 2022 Mail and Guardian Top 200 Young South Africans Award. So this was just a brief introduction to the facilitator for the day. Professor Nomali Ngobese, can you please just join us and briefly greet us, and you can now start with a session, hoping that most people can be able to join. Thank you. I hope you enjoy this session and you find it informative. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miya, for the introduction. Colleagues, I am so happy you are able to join, right? This is because I'm aware that we are under different load shedding schedules across the country if you're in South Africa. And if you're outside, you've had to sort of work out the time in your schedule to join us for this workshop. I'm happy to be here and share some of the information that we're going to talk about, and I hope it will be some sort of discussion. But before I begin, Dr. Miya, I was surprised that you didn't introduce yourself. Do you need some time, space to introduce for those who don't know you? Dr. Miya, can you hear me?
Okay, you were cutting a bit. I only had introduce, something about introduce. So can you please go again?
I was wondering if you left out the introduction on purpose of yourself. I think you jumped to all of us, and there might be people who don't know you.
Okay, I'm Dr. Silindile Miya from University of Fort Hare Agronomy Department under the unit Crop Science. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to facilitate this workshop. May I just get some feedback if you can see my slide and hear me? Because now I'm concerned on whether I'm coming through on your end or not. Can I get some confirmation? Can you hear me and can you see the slide?
Yes, we can see, we can hear. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to request that maybe you assist in terms of managing the chat because I won't be able to see it as I'm talking. Colleagues, I'm going to share some information about systematic reviews. Now, this is actually an approach to conducting a literature review, and it falls among other approaches that are already existing. So I was happy to hear that there are people already crafting their own literature reviews, which I think would provide maybe then a platform for us to engage and talk about things that go beyond what I will share in these slides. On my end, I'm hoping to just share some tips on how you can approach doing a systematic review of the literature that you are currently working with so that you can eventually come up with a document that would be suitable for submission to a journal for possible publication. And I'm aware that some people may be hoping to just draft a review for maybe as part of their dissertation, or they'd like to maybe just learn for later use. In this talk or this workshop, I'll just share, I would prefer to approach it from a point of just saying it's a strategy or one way of approaching literature reviewing. So literature reviewing as a whole is a concept that we engage in to inform ourselves so that we are well informed to propose studies, start planning studies, or start planning our research. And it's usually something that is done at the beginning to sort of gather information about the field of interest or the field that we are engaging in terms of research. So it's actually a phase of exploration where you want to see what has been documented within the field and how much work has been done so that when you delve into your own research, you don't repeat things that have already been done and reinvent the wheel. So when we take a systematic approach to reviewing literature, then we sort of take a structured approach of doing it. And the approach itself can take a number of pathways, and I'll share a couple with you. Now, literature reviewing is a very important step of undertaking research, because if basically look at it like this, if you don't know what is being done within a subject or a topic of interest, or what has been done, you run a very high chance of doing research that is not necessary, that is not going to assess or assist the community you're working with, if you're working with a community, and that is not going to contribute meaningfully to a scientific community you are part of. So it's very important that then you inform yourself about what already exists within that field. And this is usually done through a literature review. Literature reviews in general also tend to allow us to identify gaps. Besides just informing us of what already exists in the field, it also allows us to identify gaps, identify research questions that have been left unanswered, identify opportunities for more research to be done, and also identify maybe things that have been overlooked within the field that may be assumed to be common knowledge or basic practices, but have never really been investigated. So it provides a good foundation for a start of research. Now, if you, depending on what the type of work you do, I've heard people talk about working with surveys, testing agricultural practices, and you may be new at such an approach or doing such research. So you need to then inform yourself of what has been happening within just the agricultural practices that are adopted by farmers, and whether adoption is even possible to start off with within the communities that we are working with. Now, objectives in coming up or in going into reviewing a literature are many. There may be different reasons for you to go into it. Just saying it's a foundational phase, it's you trying to gather background information, is actually broad. So you may be interested in only just identifying what has been written on the subject. Now, remember, if you're going to engage in literature, it means you are going to look into things that are already written and documented somehow. And this is how come it is called a literature review. You are actually looking at things that are already documented around the topic or the subject. So your interest may just solely be around identifying what has been documented, what's available there. Or you may be interested in determining the extent to which the research area has been investigated to. You may be interested in just noting out the patterns, looking at how developments have gone on over time, leading to where we are today. Or you may be interested in just looking at the findings, the most notable findings in the field, so that you can then plan your research accordingly, come up with research questions that will help you narrow a broad topic that you are interested in investigating. You may be interested in just generating new frameworks in addition to maybe connecting the information and gathering patterns in the development of knowledge over time. You may be interested in now coming up with frameworks upon discovering what patterns or the trends that exist in the literature. You may also want to sort of come up with a topic. You don't even have a topic to begin with. You sort of have a subject as basic as or as simple as just a crop. You're interested in working maize, for instance, and you don't necessarily have a topic that you want to work with. And that on its own necessitates that you start reviewing literature around maize so that you can identify aspects that you may be interested in for research. So, and those are just examples of some of the objectives you may have going into a literature review. Now, there are different types of reviews, like I mentioned. Here, I'm going to just highlight 5, of which a systematic review is one of. I think the most common type of literature review is actually a narrative review, which is just a traditional way of looking at literature and sort of telling a story on what has happened in the literature over time. Now, we also have a systematic review, which I'm going to talk about in this workshop. We have scoping reviews and integrative reviews. Integrative reviews actually a combination of the different types, 2 or more of the other types of reviews that you see in this list, or you can also conduct a meta-analysis. I'll briefly describe what these are, and in describing them, it's because I mainly just want to make you aware should you be at a stage where you've started reviewing literature. This will help you identify what type of literature you're currently working on. If you have worked on a literature review before and you are not sure what type of literature review you've done, maybe this description will also assist you in identifying exactly what type of review you've done. I know that with our development in academia, student training, maybe you may have been introduced to the concept of literature reviewing, maybe at 4th year, at 3rd year, and you were not quite aware how much goes into each of the types. You were not even aware that there were different types. So hopefully now by the end of this workshop, you'll be able to identify what is what in the different types of reviews that are available. So like I mentioned, a narrative review is sort of based on storytelling, where you describe what's happening in the existing literature. It's usually done just to provide context, background information. It's a broad approach to actually trying to find out what is happening. Now, it has a couple of advantages attached to it. One is that it's very good for people who are coming into a new field and need to understand the wide scope of literature that is done, and need to understand the progression of developments and advancements that have been acquired within a field, and sort of provide them with context for a study, just a broad and general context for a study. Now, a narrative review can be done. I think the best narrative reviews are actually done by experts, people who already have worked in a field for a while, because they have a comprehensive view of the field itself and the things that have been done, and usually can tell what is important to include in a background document, or sort of a document that will provide a context for the field. However, narrative reviews can also be done by novice writers, amateur writers or new writers, people coming into the field. And this requires quite an extensive search in the literature so that you can gather as much of the information that has been published as possible. Now, if you're a new writer, this actually requires a lot of reading so that you develop the skill of telling what is important over what is not so important in the field. And obviously, the more experience you get, the better you become at it. So I would encourage you, even if you are starting, that you do start and do a narrative review, because you can only gather or get experience by doing reviews, and the more you do, the more experienced you become. Now, a systematic review, unlike a narrative review, would still involve a bit of storytelling, but it provides a more structured approach to actually assessing literature. So when conducting a systematic review, you'd actually have a structured, detailed approach to how you are going to do it. So you have things there like you need to have predetermined search engines that you are going to use to collect the literature you're going to review. And in collecting the literature you're going to review, you'd have to set up strategically keywords that you'll use to actually screen the different types of papers and books and sources of information that you are using. This then allows you to take a step-by-step approach to assessing literature. And this will actually increase the chances or the probability of having the approach being reproducible. What that means is if you come up with a structure or a selected list of steps that you are going to take in reviewing your literature, then you can sort of take that structure, transfer it to the next writer so that they can take the exact same approach in reviewing the literature, regardless of whether they're reviewing literature within the same subject or not. Now, systematic reviews also allow for a more rigorous and thorough review of literature, because you sort of have to determine what is important to include in your structure or your framework or your screening criteria for selecting literature. This is usually just used way before you even start reading the papers. So you'll have to have an approach to how you select the papers that eventually form part of the readings that you'll use in your literature review. Now, because of the structured approach to reviewing the literature, it eliminates most biases that can emerge maybe from just doing a narrative review. Remember, a narrative review, we said, is something that will be done by someone who's most likely experienced or who's going to get experience through reading a lot of papers so that they determine what's important and what's not important. Now, with narrative reviews, there's a good chance that a person who's experienced would have developed a liking or an affinity for one aspect of the field more than other aspects, which then could create bias in tending to lean towards discussing or reviewing papers that talk about that aspect and not shining as much of a light in other aspects. However, if you have a structured approach, as in taking a systematic approach to reviewing the literature, all you will transfer from one reviewer to the next, so the person who's writing a review to the next, is just the framework or the list of criteria you are going to use in selecting literature, which then takes care of most of the biases that come into play. I've already mentioned the reproducibility component, that systematic reviews actually introduce increase the chances of the review being reproducible because you've got a structured approach to reviewing the literature. Now, in terms of scoping reviews are generally done to just map out what has happened in a field. So the people who engage in scoping reviews, they often date them and track maybe developments over time and say, you're reviewing literature from 2009 maybe year 2000 to year 2010, in developments in HIV research, for instance. So in that case, that will then allow or make it possible for you to do a time map, and have papers that would be reviewed just under maybe 2001, from the year 2000 to 2001, and have papers that fell between 2001 and 2002, some that fall between 2002 and 2003, and so on and so forth. So it allows you to create some sort of map as to what is happening. And it does not only have to be done in terms of just years, mapping what happens over years. It can be done to map up what happens across the world in different regions, to sort of see what developments, pick out the trends and developments from the different parts of the world, and create a world map in terms of the concentration of research, which regions tend to focus more, tend to do a lot of research in your field of interest, compared to which regions would not engage in research in that field, for instance. So it also would create a broad overview and sort of a background to the research that you're interested in, or the subject area that you're working on. An integrative review, I already briefly described this. So it's a combination of the different types. It can be 2 or more than 2, but also an integrative review allows you to then pull from sort of different sources and integrate those sources, which might not be necessarily restricted to your field. Let's say, for instance, you're working in agriculture per se. It can go across fields and allow you to work with maybe agricultural research, agriculture related research that is done in computer sciences, for instance, and can still fit within an integrative literature review if, let's say, you are trying to get a review or review the field on agricultural research that has been used for technology development. Then you can pull from different fields, because some of the technologies will actually be formulated from mathematical models that have been done by computer scientists and not necessarily agriculturalists. Now, taking a more integrative approach to literature reviewing will assist a lot rather than maybe just doing a systematic review where you just provide sort of a structured approach, looking at only one field or one research area, focusing in agriculture only. It allows you to unify different perspectives and therefore be able to generate new insights from looking at the different fields, but from a perspective of trying to combine them under the same review. A meta-analysis is actually a statistical technique that is taken to combine results from a literature search. So just to give you a very broad description, a meta-analysis would be an approach where you provide a couple of keywords, and then you start quantifying how many of the hits that you have actually fall within a known or a subcategory or a sub topic or a subtitle of your literature review. And you start applying some statistical analysis to actually come up with figures that give your findings statistical power, to say maybe most of the researchers, or a majority, or 60% of the research that is done within the field only focuses on that particular subject area, which is a subject or a subheading within a literature review. It tends to be more general and does not provide detail in discussing different aspects about the review itself or the subheadings that you'll be discussing. So now delving into systematic reviews, from this slide onwards, I'm only going to focus on systematic reviews. So the systematic approach, I mentioned that you'll have to have a selected criteria that you will use in actually approaching the review or the way that you're reviewing literature. Now, a number of people have come up with structures that can be used when conducting a systematic review. What's important and tends to be general in terms of the approach itself, not the criteria, is that people want to first, you have to define the problem that you're trying to solve, or at least come up with a question you're trying to answer, or identify some sort of research question that you want to be your departing platform. This allows you to at least have the first keywords or set of keywords that you can use in searching for literature. And although this would be the first step, now it does not limit you that you only have that question. There can be an evolution from within that step itself, where you find out that maybe your research question or your initial problem, excuse me, your initial problem was too broad. It was too general, and then you may decide to move a step further and refine that into another research problem, or at least identified problem that you are going to use for reviewing literature.
Why do you feel the need to explain?
I can hear some feedback on from someone's mic.
You're not supposed to have
May I ask that the person mutes their mic?
did not tell me that.
Dr. Miya, if I can have your assistance, is it possible to just
where's
type on their chat and request them to mute their mic?
Okay, I'll do that. Thanks.
So when you've defined a problem or you've come up with at least the starting research question, and this obviously should be your launching platform, where you think, okay, this sort of gives me a mandate to go and review literature or look at literature. Then you can use that to come up with the first set of keywords that you can use for searching literature. Now, in the actual step of searching for literature, this is where you'd have to use a list of criteria to actually select the literature that you are going to use, and eventually select the literature that you're going to use to inform your thoughts in writing the documents that you produce at the end of the literature search. Now, the second step, which is literature searching, is very crucial, and I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about it in the coming slides. Once you've found the literature you're going to search, you then go into summarizing that literature and then refining the arguments, or coming up with an argument or sort of an angle that you're going to take in the discussion of the entire document. Now, you'd have to come up with some sort of argument or sort of a stance where you're coming from in terms of the literature itself, the literature review itself as a document. So you develop a tone in what you are talking about and how you are discussing the matters you're going to discuss in the actual document. Then once you have an argument, you will be able to then sort of develop a structure. The structure will be comprised of different subheadings that will form the entire literature review that you produce at the end of writing. Now, when you have that structure, you'll have to put it down as an outline. That structure, sort of like subheadings falling under a topic for a literature review, will then give you an outline. An outline is basically just subheadings that fall or comprise the literature review. Now, from the literature you've collected in the second step, you will then go on and thoroughly discuss those subheadings that you have used as part of the outline to the document. This then leads you to the drafting phase where you actually write and start filling up the different sections or subsections of your literature review. The last stage would usually occur when you reach the end, when you've drafted something up and you've read the drafts, you've given your draft to a couple of people to have a look maybe. And you are now happy with the sort of the voice you are using, the topics covered, the subheadings covered in the document, and you are happy with the arguments that you've put out in the literature review itself. And people have given you feedback on how it sounds and whether there's a logical flow in how you discuss the subtopics themselves. Once you reach that stage, then you'll be able to communicate your literature review as either a submission in your dissertation, a submission in a paper, or a draft that goes out to a journal for further consideration, or you can even present this at a conference or at a gathering, because you would have had some sort of feedback from peers who would have some experience in terms of the field itself, to give you feedback on whether you've covered the topic comprehensively. Now, in the first step where you need to identify your research problem or identify a research question. Now, this is actually important because remember we said this is a launching stage where you determine where you're going to launch yourself from in now embarking in searching for literature. If you do not have a clear question or a relevant question to the topic you are interested in, you can actually end up reviewing literature at a tangent that is completely going the opposite direction to what you want to research or conduct your research in. So it's very important that you spend time in just refining the problem and coming up with the research questions, or at least the questions that you are going to start out with that will help you come up with keywords in reviewing literature. Now, when you go into searching for the actual literature, which follows after coming up with a problem or identifying a problem, coming up with questions, this on its own will take a certain approach. You'd have to decide, I mentioned earlier, you'd have to decide on the search engines that you're going to use. So I'm going to also share a bit on the different sources you can approach in searching for literature. And please note, this is before I even talk about the criteria that would be used in selecting the literature that you'll eventually use. So in looking for literature, you'll have to approach different sources of literature, right? Now, I think most of us are based at universities, and some people might be based at research institutions or research councils. This then would mean you've got some sort of access to a library system where you can access literature either through journals, through books, magazines, industry booklets, or even a library, even online repositories that are available through a library system that will allow you to access a wide range of papers or sources that you can use as your literature. Now, this is usually the first step that most people take. So if you're going to start, I highly encourage that you explore the library system that you have access to see what is available to you, so you can search for you can conduct your initial search. At this stage, you would have already come up with a couple of keywords, so you sort of have a lead on things that you can use to search for literature that might assist you. In addition to using a library system, you can just do a general internet search by using specific search engines that are known to be credible and provide reliable literature to inform your thoughts, or at least inform or expose you to the type of literature that's available within a field. So in this particular slide, I'm giving examples of some of the search engines that are popular within a science field, specifically the plant sciences, the agriculture, crop science side of things. The most popular search engines would be Science Direct, Web of Science, Scopus, and Google Scholar. And all of these vary in terms of the scope of articles or books or sources they'll be available to you. Some will tend to have a very wide scope like Google Scholar and will pull anything from books to journal articles to patents, for instance, theses. Some of the theses have been uploaded on Google Scholar, and which could be nice for a general search. But some people may say, for instance, because of how general and how wide the search would be on Google Scholar, then maybe you tend to go for a more narrower, stricter database in terms of pulling credible sources. So you tend to go for things like Web of Science or Scopus, which mainly will have a good concentration of just journal articles. Now, the databases also differ in how they actually file the papers or the literature sources that you'll be able to get there. Some will allow for a dating system where you can actually select or filter your hits or whatever you get back when you put in your keywords. They will allow you to filter them according to dates. Some will allow you to filter them according to subjects. Some will allow you to filter according to type of publication. Like you can tell the search engine to only give you journal articles, for instance, or you can tell it to only give you books. Or you can tell it to only give you theses, or it can even go to an even wider search, which I highly don't recommend, which is a general Google search. Now, what's important about this is that you actually want credible sources of information that you can use as literature. And as just a general rule of thumb, this would mean you need peer-reviewed sources. I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of peer-reviewed sources that you can use in the coming slide. Now, I've been talking about keywords, and it may be taken for granted that we know what keywords are. For those who are not exposed to the concept of keywords, keywords are just a combination of words or a phrase that you can use or put in your search engine to search for documents that fall within your subject area. It can be as long as a full question, a full research question, but generally you can also use just a couple of words, 2 words, 3 words to search for articles. The fewer the words that comprise your keywords, the more general the search will tend to be. So if you are still at the initial phases of searching for literature, you tend to use fewer keywords or as a string of words as your keywords, so that you sort of fetch a wide range of topics or titles, and then this will help you then determine what is more important, refine your research question, refine your keywords, and then come up with sort of longer keywords that will then allow you to have a more targeted search for literature. So here I've just put a couple of examples, maybe that can resonate within with the different topics we're working on. You may use things like you want to maybe fetch articles that talk about the development of nematodes in potato, or you may want to know more about soybean production in South Africa, or you may be interested in looking at Bambara, for instance, the groundnuts, but only want to know about biogas slurry application on Bambara. Although there will be quite a lot of literature around Bambara as a whole, as a crop, if you only use Bambara as the keyword or the search phrase in your keyword section or of your search engine, you will not be able to fetch the most detailed and targeted papers that can lead you to discussing biogas application or biogas slurry application, for instance, which would mean that more effort will be required in filtering through the number of hits you would have acquired before you get to what you are going to use. Whereas if you use a longer string of words, which aligns more closely to your research question or your subject area, like biogas slurry application, then you'll actually get create a higher chance, a greater chance of you obtaining relevant literature, relevant papers, and actually getting relevant books that you can eventually use in your literature. I've mentioned the last point in the previous slide, so I'm not going over it or skipping over it. Now, in looking at literature, the different types of literature that you can find, I've mentioned books, I've mentioned journal articles. You may be wondering what the difference is in all of them, right? Now, generally, the most general way of categorizing the literature or the type of sources you have is what I'm showing on screen, where you can look at primary literature. These are usually studies or publications that originate from studies that have been done in a subject area. So in these sort of sources which fall under primary literature, it's where experiments are being reported, investigations are being reported, results from a study conducted are being reported. That will then comprise primary literature. It can be reported in dissertations, theses, technical reports, conference proceedings, journal articles. All of that will basically be just direct reports that come from investigations that have been done. It's original research. You can also look at secondary literature. Now, secondary literature is usually just a summary of the primary literature that was obtained. So it's usually broader and does not provide details like very detailed methodologies on how the studies were conducted. It will only summarize what was found for the purpose of just providing the general picture of what has been done either in the field or in a topic itself, but not necessarily as evidence or reporting results that emanated from one singular study. Secondary literature can also combine multiple studies and report on what multiple studies have found so that it creates some sort of narrative on what's happening in a field. We usually find this in literature reviews, which is what we are currently engaging in, or at least discussing in this workshop. We also find this in books. So when you find you read books, there are different types of books, right? But when you find books, let's say for instance, you're reading a book that talks about irrigation. A book talking about irrigation will generally refer to different studies or cites different studies that have been conducted around irrigation and does not necessarily focus on one experiment. And there's a huge difference between a book and a dissertation, of which a dissertation might be, or a thesis might be the length of a book, but it actually reports on primary research that was conducted to address a particular aim or objectives. A book does not necessarily address one particular aim or objective. It sort of summarizes what has been found within the particular subject. You can also find or use tertiary literature, which is not often advisable when you come up with a literature review because of how distant it is from primary sources of literature. So under tertiary literature, you can find textbooks, the ones that you use for teaching, for instance. You can include things like dictionaries, encyclopedias, and handbooks. So they tend to be quite general and sometimes don't even cite statistics or results that will be obtained from primary literature. So this is one source of information that you should limit when conducting a literature review. Now, the degree of detail provided in terms of the subject area varies, with primary literature having the most detail being provided and tertiary literature having the least detail provided. So I spoke about systematic reviews being an approach that will require that we come up with a criteria or a list of or a framework that we'll use in actually screening and selecting literature. So in this slide, I'm going to talk about the screening process on its own. So let's say, for instance, now you've conducted your search, you've decided to use a Scopus, for instance, and you've told Scopus you want to only look at journal articles, and you've given Scopus your key words, and it has now pulled, maybe you've just given it Bambara slurry application, and you want to see how much literature you get from there. Now, let's say it gives you a hit list of 1,035 papers, 1,035 papers that come through as having matched the keywords that you've given the search engine. You now have to decide on what you are going to read and what you are not going to read. Now, you need to have a screening procedure, a process in place that will allow you to actually screen or select what you'll use and decide what you will not use. Now, the screening procedure is usually comprised of that framework or the list of criteria that you've set up or you've put up for yourself. And this you can apply just based on the topic of or the title of the study by looking at all the titles that have been pulled in your search. This alone would allow you to select some of the articles and ignore some of the articles. It allows you to narrow down your hit to only what you think might be relevant. So in coming up with a criteria, you sort of would have to determine what's important about Bambara's Larry application that you like to read up on. So if you know that maybe you want to read up maybe about the different types of slurries that have been applied on Bambara, then you'll say then type of slurry applied is one of the criterion that you're going to use. And then let's say you decide that maybe you also want to look at the region of application of the Bambara slurry as one of the things that you'll consider separately in selecting your literature. Then you can use the region of slurry application as the second criterion in your list of criteria you're going to use for selecting literature. Now, just these two alone will allow you to sift through the 1,035 hits you've now pulled, just based on the titles that you have in that entire hit list. This will allow you to now compare your criteria to the topics and see if the topics align to the criteria or not. If they align, you file or you save the topic, or you sort of save it if you've got some sort of library system that you're using, like EndNote. You can save it on your EndNote so that you can come back and read those articles later. Now, using that initial screening process would allow you to narrow down the search maybe from 1,035 hits to maybe 356. You now have 356 papers that fall within the criteria that you have. This will then allow you to then move on to the next step. You can then start reading the abstracts. An abstract in a paper would be a summary of what the whole paper talks about. Now, a title will only give you a sneak peek into what the paper actually talks about and allow you to sort of select, filter, screen down to the 356. Once you get to the 356, you may now need more information to really know if the papers you've selected actually are relevant or aligned to your criteria. This you can determine by using a summary of the paper, which is the abstract. So you can then go on and read the abstracts of the 356 papers and see if it actually aligns to the criteria you are using. If it does align to the criteria, then you can keep the paper for later use, where you then go on and read the entire paper. If it does not align to the criteria, then you can discard or let go of that paper because it will not be relevant for what you are reviewing or the subject area you are reviewing. So that's that stage of filtering after you've read the abstract on its own will then allow you to narrow down the papers from the 356 to now fewer papers. Please do note that the numbers I'm using are just merely examples. You can narrow down from the 1035 to maybe 950, for instance, which is absolutely fine. That just means that the initial hit you got, or the list of papers you got from the initial set, was relatively accurate or relevant to what you wanted. Therefore, even when you go on and read the abstracts, you still end up with a high number of papers that you need to read. That's absolutely fine and acceptable. Now, when you've done the initial screening, you will then have to sort of go into the next step, which is sort of a more engaging approach with the literature. So the initial screening would have probably exposed you to a wide number of, a large number of papers. And the number of papers, although it is large, it might still be relevant, related to your topic, because you are using a list of criteria, right? Then you'll have to move on and actually read these papers so that you can see what would be relevant for putting down in your document or using in your draft of a literature review, in drafting the literature review. Now, I've sort of selected two methodologies that are quite, are used popularly, well, are quite popular in agriculture. In doing systematic reviews, you'll see on the right-hand side, I've got an example of an approach that is used, or at least that is published by Prisma. This was published in 2020. It's a flow diagram which documents an approach to conducting systematic reviews. In this flow diagram, they propose a three-step process into conducting a systematic review, where you do the initial search to identify records or literature that are potentially relevant to your review or your study topic. Now, this is the same stage where I described in a previous study, where you just get a wide or a big number of records coming through after you've given the search engine your initial keywords. And with the identification of the initial records, now you can keep changing your keywords. You don't have to just only use one keyword and that's it, one set of keywords and that's it. You can actually keep refining the keywords up until you gather enough literature so that you can conduct the initial screening process. So in the initial identification of literature, you will have to then note the databases that you have used. So if you've used a combination of all the ones that I've mentioned, you probably would have to note that you use Scopus, Science Direct, Web of Science, and Google Scholar to look for records in that you are potentially going to use. Now, you need to note the number of databases, and you also need to note the name of the databases. This allows for that element of reproducibility to be introduced in the approach you are using for reviewing literature. So now, as you are noting this, it's actually going to become part of the methodology that you will document in the actual draft of your literature review. Now, in instances where you've consulted registers, national registers, national databases, even registers that exist within your own university or research council library, you also need to note the number and also need to note the name of the register that you used. Once you have that initial one, you will then have to go into the next stage, which is screening, and then you start screening using your criteria, right? So you start off, you'd say, for instance, you had 4 databases that you used in the identification stage. Then you said you have n equals 4. And then in terms of registers, if you had any registers, you indicate the number. If you don't have any registers, then you say just n is 0 if you are following the prism flow diagram. You then move on to the screening process, where you now indicate the number of records you obtained from the databases and registers that were used for identifying literature. Now, this is where the 1035 is going to go as the number of records that you will go on and screen. Now, in the records, the 1035 you will screen, you'll then use your criteria to sort and narrow that down. Now, if you've got your criteria of maybe 5 things you're looking for, this means that your screening process will go through 5 sorting stages. So let's say, for instance, you first used, in the previous example for Bambara slurry application, you first use, now I've lost track. I know one of the examples was that you use region of slurry application, and maybe you might have the type of slurry that is being applied as one of the criterion, and you may decide to include as one of the criterion the year of application or the year of development of the slurry. Now, that will then create a 3 criteria process, which will mean that the screening or the sorting process of the screening stage will then have 3 stages. You will, at each stage, you need to note the number that is retained within the records number that you are working with, up until you get to the final criterion that you are using. You don't only note the number of retrieved records, but you also need to note the reason that it was retained. Now, depending on the criterion that you have, you may find that your search engine and also the search engine you're using, you may find that some search engines will actually retain duplicates. An example would be maybe in Google Scholar, for instance, one record by Dr. Miya was entered twice because one record was pulled as a 2011 publication because it was uploaded, the author uploaded it on ResearchGate before it was published in hard copy. And they uploaded it as a 2011 publication because it was available online as a 2011 publication. However, the following year, which was 2012, the very same publication was then noted as a 2012 publication because that is when the hard print or the hard copy became available for the very same publication. Now, when Google Scholar files the records, it files it twice because rightfully so, it does appear as a 2011 publication and also appears as a 2012 publication. When you are doing your screening, because you are reading the titles and you start reading the abstracts, you'll now start to notice that there is a record by Dr. Miya that appears as a 2011 record, but also appears as a 2012 record, but it has exactly the same title and exactly the same abstract. That then creates reasons to exclude that repetition, that repeated record, because exclude one of those records because it's basically the same thing being misfiled or appearing twice because of the different ways of publication or media for publishing the record. So you note such things because they will most likely narrow down the number of records you'll eventually take to the next stage of sorting. You may have other reasons for removing records as well. Let's say your general set, your initial search is too broad. It's pulling people's dissertations, theses. It's also pulling things from online that people would publish in their websites, and you're not interested in those, and you may choose to exclude those sources. So then you put a reason that, okay, some sources were excluded because they were not peer reviewed. For instance, if you say they're not peer reviewed, it's basically a dissertation, which some people would consider to have not been peer reviewed because a dissertation would have likely gone through examiners which examine the work for a student and not necessarily peer reviewers who would have maybe looked at it to gauge on whether it is suitable for publication for the general scientific community. And if you choose not to use dissertations and you choose not to use theses, you can exclude them on those grounds, because some people tend to consider examiners to not necessarily be peer reviewers or as rigorous or as strict in reviewing or at least giving feedback to a thesis or a dissertation as peer reviewers maybe that would be obtained by a journal or obtained by a book, for instance. So if you choose to select to use that as an excluding criteria, it's well within your rights, but you need to note the reasons that some publications have been excluded because of this and that and that. This then would be able to inform the next person who's trying to conduct a systematic review within the same subject to say, now, this is the approach they can use so that they eliminate bias, and in eliminating the bias, they should use sort of the same exclusion criteria as you did in selecting the literature that eventually they use for drafting the article. Now, once you're done with the literature screening process, you'll often end up with studies that will be included in the final report. Now, the list of studies can vary hugely. Like I've seen some people who have maybe 59, 60 public records that they use as references. Some people will have maybe anything from 120 that they can use. Now, you are free to use whatever you think is relevant and necessary, depending on your criteria. However, you may be limited or have restrictions if you are targeting, for instance, a particular journal where you want to submit the literature review to, and the journal itself has page limitations for articles that are published there. That means then you'll actually have to cut down the number of references you have so that you can stick to the page limitations that are published by the journal. So I've just gone through describing the PRISMA workflow, or at least the PRISMA approach to doing systematic reviews. Did mention the number of these that are available there. In this slide, I'm only showing two. There's also an example of an approach that was used by Kautos et al. In 2019. Here, this is an approach that they used in conducting a systematic review of literature reviews, which is quite a complex process, because they were actually trying to review literature reviews and sort of sum up what is happening in the field of reviewing literature within the discipline, so that they can come up with some sort of framework of what is happening and come up with a protocol that they can use in their approach to conducting research and going forward. So you can read up on that at a later stage, should you be interested in conducting a literature review of reviews. Now, one thing that you need to keep note of, which is very important in conducting a systematic review, is that there's going to be a lot of extracting information. In other instances, you'll be extracting actual values from the literature, so you can report in your own document. And that the data that are extracted, or the information that are extracted, now can be summarized within your own document, so that it's easy for you to create an argument around it. This requires that you have a skill at synthesizing information. And a tip in doing this is actually to try and summarize or extract data and put it in a summative table format. So let's say, for instance, you want to know different agricultural practices that are applied for leafy vegetables. This is just a general example. Now you go on and say agricultural practices applied in leafy vegetables, and you use that as your keywords. Now you find a lot of literature, and you take the literature through the screening process, you sort it, and you end up with 80 papers. And from those 80 papers, you want to use all of them. But now you want to summarize the most commonly used agricultural practices in leafy vegetables. You can then read the papers, and whatever agricultural practices you find there, you put them in a table, so that it's easier for your reader now, who's going to be reading your literature review, to sort of gather which agricultural practices are used within the field of leafy vegetables, for instance. Now you can have a table that it can be as wide as a couple of pages, because there are a lot of agricultural practices, or you can have a table that fits within one page, because there isn't that much variability in terms of the agricultural practices that are used. Now the table itself is a synthesis of information, allows you to synthesize the information, put it together so that it's easily absorbable to your reader. Now, instead of having a reader go and read the 90 papers, they can simply look at your review and know from just looking at that table alone that this is the scope of agricultural practices that are used in leafy vegetables. So this is a skill you'll have to develop. And mind you, on your end, you'll read quite extensively to come up with just that one table, which seems like a very basic thing to someone who's reading, but you would have had to apply the skill of synthesizing information to actually put it in just one page or 2 pages, or just one table for easy presentation. Now, once you've synthesized information and structured it according to different subheadings in your literature review, you'd have to remember to actually have an argument, or be able to draw parallels in the types of different papers that you read, or be able to pick up inconsistencies where people seem to be doing exactly the same thing, studying the same subject, but picking up different trends, coming up with different findings, contradicting each other. Now, you'll only be able to do that by actually reading and critiquing the papers that you read, You'll have to look closely at things like the methods that people employ in conducting the studies. Look at the way they approach analyzing the data, the way they approach interpreting the results that they find. And look out for any errors that may come up from maybe each one of the papers you've looked at. You may be able to identify sources of error that may be applied in one paper, leading to a completely contradicting interpretation of data to another paper. Now, being able to pick up those things will then allow you to form arguments and sort of create your own voice and your own stance in the literature review and the document you are creating. Now, once you have the entire list of papers that you are looking at, now I'm getting a bit anxious about time, so I'll start to move faster. Now, once you have a list of literature that you are going to use and you are using for drafting, you have to get to a final step where you actually put things down. You write. Now, over the reading phase, you may have been taking notes, right? And this is very advised. I highly advise that you do this. Some people tend to take the approach of just printing out their papers, using a highlighter to highlight the most important information, and then transferring the most important points to a new document so that they can put points that align closely to each other according to subheadings and sort of draft as they read the papers. This is a very productive approach to doing things, where some people would rather just collect everything, read all the papers once, walk away, think about it, think about their own voice, what they think, so that they develop their own perspective on the literature they've read, and then come back, read it the second time so that they can write their review. Whichever one works for you, that you should employ that. What's important is that eventually you have to use the data, the papers you've collected to draft up the document so that you can create a first draft that you can then read to sort of gather whether there's a logical flow, and then give it to a peer or a friend so that they can give you feedback on how it sounds. Now you can have a number of review stages where you give it to peers, and peers read the draft, give you feedback, give you things to improve upon, points to maybe focus on a little bit more, points to add things on, maybe points to remove, or maybe things you should consider so that you change your arguments. That is a very important stage so that you could create a coherent document at the end. Now, once you've finished the drafting stage and you've given it to someone to read a couple of times, this is usually the first green light you get, that, okay, now you've got a readable document, something that can be used to inform someone to a certain degree. Then you can go on and submit that for, if maybe you've got a supervisor and your student, and your supervisor is the one who gets the final say on whether you can submit for publication to a journal, or you can submit for examination, then you give it to your supervisor. If there is, you don't have anyone else who's sort of gatekeeping, then you can go ahead and submit to a journal for consideration by an editor. Now, I've already highlighted the importance of conducting a systematic review, which is just the elimination of bias, and also creating a framework, the use of a framework that will increase the chance of reproducibility. Also, people generally within the scholarly community tend to consider systematic reviews to be more credible rather than narrative reviews, for instance. This is because of the rigor that goes into writing a review, and you having to come up with the criteria and actually screening the type of publications that you are going to use. People tend to trust that a little bit more than a scoping and a narrative review. I'm not going to cover this due to time. Now you can go into assessing the quality of the review or the literature itself. But usually if you're going to submit the literature review or the draft or a manuscript to a journal, the quality assessment part of it is done by reviewers, because reviewers would be experts within the field who are identified by journals so that they can assist you in determining whether the approach is acceptable, the sources you've used are actually credible enough to be acceptable within the scholarly community you are communicating to. A supervisor as well can also assist in the quality assessment part of it, and also examiners of a dissertation fall into the gatekeepers that can actually assess the quality of the document. I'm going to skip this. I'll talk a bit about challenges that you can find in reviewing literature or just creating or conducting a systematic review. Common challenges would be first and foremost the overload in terms of information, because remember you start off with the basic search, and this will fetch hundreds, sometimes thousands of papers, and you have to sit and read all of this, right? Now, depending on your skill or your level of experience, it may overwhelm you. You may find a lot of conflicting studies within the relevant literature that you find, which would be just part of the challenges you experience. And people usually at the end of their studies will propose solutions to the future or for future research, and these on their own can be conflicting. And this would be a challenge to you in terms of selecting one over the other, or in you coming up with proposing approaches to research that will actually lead to you coming up with research questions for your own studies. Now, in conducting a literature review, I have to highlight the ethical considerations. Since you'll be reading quite a lot of other people's work, it's very important that you avoid things like plagiarism, where you use word for word what people have used, or you use their tables, their pictures, and you mainly just copy and paste into your document, which may lead into copyright issues. So if it's published information, let's say a table, data, a set of data by a researcher, or a picture or a diagram, you'd have to actually, in most instances where there are copyrights, you'll have to contact the copyright owners and request for permission to republish if you are going to publish your own review. So please take note that the ethical considerations that you need to actually keep in mind, so that you protect the intellectual property of others and you don't infringe on their rights. I've got some tips on how to paraphrase, and I'm not going to go into much detail on this. I put the slide in here for people who are new at reviewing literature, right? That actually, for you to avoid plagiarism and using people's information or ideas word for word, you'd have to go through the process of paraphrasing what they have said. If you're not sure how to do this, please follow this guideline. I am going to share my slides so that you are able to sort of synthesize the information, rewrite it, summarize it in your own words, so that you are able to communicate information in your own words and not in other people's words. Where you are using people's ideas, it's common practice that you need to cite them, use the references, so that you give them credit for their ideas, their findings, and their inventions. Towards the end of your own document, you should come up with a direction for future research. And if you are doing a literature review at the proposal development stage, actually the future research that you're going to recommend is most likely going to be the research that you will conduct in your own study. This now makes sure that you are well informed to actually propose objectives and come up with research questions for your own research when you're coming up with a proposal. Benefits, since I've already mentioned these, I'm not going to highlight a number of them. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of recent literature reviews that have been produced in agronomy and crop science specifically. This slide I'm showing you two. The one on the left is an example where they were looking at agronomic practices to increase the yield and quality of common bean. And this is a systematic review. So we'll briefly read through the abstract so that you get a sense of the approach that they took to reviewing the literature. So they say common bean is the most important legume for human consumption worldwide and an important source of vegetable protein, minerals, antioxidants, bioactive compounds, and nitrogen fixation capacity of the crop reduces its demand for synthetic nitrogen fertilizer application to increase yield and quality. So fertilizer yield and quality of common bean may be optimized by several other agronomic practices such as irrigation, rhizobia application, sowing density, etc. Now, taking this into consideration, they conducted a systematic review which integrated a number of things with just looking at a biometric analysis of several agronomic practices that increase common bean yield and quality, and also looking at literature that was published between 1971 and 2021. So for them, they already set a criteria to sort of generate or conduct a sort of an integrated systematic review. And then they go on to describe the method. So they sort of got 250 publications from the initial search, which deal with breeding, sowing density and season, irrigation, fertilization, intercropping, soilless culture, rhizobia application, biostimulant fertilizer application, disease management, pest management, and weed management, right? So for them, they only note the initial search, what it fetched for them, and then they break it down according to the number that was fetched for each of the keywords that they used. If you read on further, then you'll be able to sort of get a sense of what they used in terms of sorting the literature. Now, what I wanted us to get from here is that they had a list of criteria that they used in actually selecting the literature or sifting or filtering the literature. They had a screening procedure in place that they used to fetch the articles that they fetched. I have a strong feeling that they actually only noted publications that they probably used after conducting the initial screening, which is where the 250 comes from. Now, you can go on and also read the approach that was taken in the second example, which is on the right, where they were evaluating phytoremediation potential of aromatic plants, and they conducted a systematic review. I've covered challenges. I'm not going to cover them. In terms of practicalities, systematic reviews generally take more time than a narrative review. This is because of the thoroughness and the rigor that goes into conducting a systematic review. Conducting a literature review will allow you to then form conclusions or conclude and come up with a strategy for your own research. This is very important. So if you do a thorough systematic review and you synthesize the information well, you'll be well informed to actually now come up with an approach to your own research and summarize the take-home message for your audience. I'm going to end it here. I think I'm about 7 minutes over time. Dr. Miya, I hope you won't complain a lot about me going over time. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Prof Ngobese. In respect of time, can we have a few questions that can be addressed here? But then again, even when we are done here, I think with your permission, would you be able to attend to some of the questions even after the session? Is that fine? Because I'm sure most of us, we have other commitments, but we can take a few questions. Can we have, by a show of hands, those who would like to pose some questions, comments, and then we can conclude this session. Okay, colleagues, if we don't have any questions, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Prof Nomali for taking time out, and for you colleagues to also take time out to attend this session. I'll come back to those hands for questions, but since we're quiet for some time, just to say thank you for taking your time and thank you for this very informative session. And I'm sure we learned a lot from this, especially for beginners and those that are already in the middle of writing a systematic review. For those who are still starting, I hope this will be very useful for you, and we'll share the content and the video as well. I have a hand up here from Ngobese. Can we have your question?
Oh, thank you so much, Doc, and much appreciation to Prof as well. I've just got a few questions on the literature review. Am I allowed, when I'm doing this systematic review, to use the old literature? And also, I think I might have missed, because I joined it later, a difference between the literature review and the systematic review. Is there a difference there? And lastly, is there a program that I can utilize when I'm doing the screening part? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ngobese. Prof, it seems like that was the only hand for now. You can address this question, and then if someone else would like to ask, we'll also attend to that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mi. Ngobese, I appreciate your questions. I got two. The second one, you wanted to know the difference between a literature review and a systematic literature review. Can you just confirm if I captured that correctly? Because I am getting a sense that maybe you meant a difference between a systematic review and a narrative or a scoping review or the other types of reviews.
Yeah, that's correct, Prof.
Thank you. So I'm going to assume you're confirming you want me to maybe differentiate between the narrative scoping and the systematic. So there is a difference. In general, literature reviews are just literature reviews where you try and get background information and inform yourself before you conduct a study, or you may want to understand what's happening in a field. So, but in just doing literature reviews, there are different approaches and different types of reviews that you can have. One is a systematic review, which is the one we were talking about. But I also highlighted the other ones, which is a narrative review, a scoping review, an integrative review, and the last one escapes my memory. So the most, I think, common ones or popular ones that you will also find in the literature when you search would be the narrative review and the scoping reviews. Or the last one is a meta-analysis. The most common ones is a narrative and a scoping review. Narrative is you just sort of documented an overview of what has happened in the field. You may be interested of doing a narrative review to see what has happened over time or to note developments over a specific time period, region. It's absolutely up to you, but you sort of want to get a broad idea as to create context for yourself. Scoping, you want to map out what has been happening. So I made an example earlier that scoping, you may want to sort of map according to time, over time, maybe ranging from year 2000 to year 2010 on what was happening in the field. And you actually have a timestamp on the literature that you use to actually say from 2000 to year 2000 to year 2001, this is what was happening from year 2001 to year 2002. This is what was happening year 2002 to year 2003. This is what was happening, so on and so forth. Now, a systematic approach to it is actually allows you, both are generally more context-based and general and broader than a systematic review. Systematic review will then allow you to apply a set of criteria so that you can synthesize information from the literature that you find. Now, the approach of doing this would be to use some sort of framework, a list of criteria that will allow you to select the literature and screen the literature and be able to organize that literature according to the subheading or subtopics that you are going to cover in the literature review itself. So it allows for more thorough engagement with the literature, detailed. You can even summarize the information in tables so that you pull from different sources and pick out trends on what's happening or what seems to be the most general trends that are emerging from the literature in the field. I hope I covered you. If I didn't, you are welcome to have a follow-up question on this. The first question, can you refresh my memory, Njobile, on the first question? Njobile?
Okay, on the first question, I was asking whether are you allowed to use the old literature on this systematic review and the importance of using a literature review, recent literature when you're doing this systematic review. I don't know if you get me.
Thank you so much, Njobile. I get you, yes. Now, it depends, right? Probably not the response you're hoping for. Now, let's say you want to, for instance, early developments of agriculture. Or early developments in irrigation scheduling. And if you want to look at the earliest developments, you'll have to go back to when irrigation or the application of water through human intervention began, which is very, very, very old. In such an instance, you'd have to use old literature and date it back from when it started to then maybe when maybe most of the development sort of slowed down, subsided, and then there was some sort of plateau in what people were doing. In comparison to someone who wants to look at the recent developments or the recent technologies developed in irrigation systems. So the title itself just indicates that the person should be either looking at old literature and then trying to move to more recent stuff, or they should only limit their search to the most recent literature. those are easy sort of topics or approaches. They will tell you whether you need to use old literature or new literature. However, some topics, or you may have been given a research topic by your funder, a sponsor, or you come up with a research topic for your own work where there is no distinguishing factor. There's no way to know whether to use old or new literature. In such instances, it's highly advisable that you use the latest literature so that you can pick up the most recent trends when coming up or proposing research. Because most of the research, or if you're at the proposal development stage, you'd want to contribute to a particular field and advance developments in the field. So to contribute, you'd want to know where we are now and where that field is right now. So the most recent literature will be able to tell you of the recent trends and the developments and tell you what has emerged already so that you can sort of come up with an approach or propose something that is still relatable to recent technologies. But please note my initial response. It depends on what you want to do. It depends on why you are reviewing literature. So it may benefit you to use all literature. It may benefit you in other instances to use the most recent literature. In other instances, you may actually need to just move across time, starting from the oldest and also referring to the latest. There are times as well where you may not want to use the oldest literature, but you do want to know how trends emerged when technologies were being invented and innovations were still coming up. Another approach of picking up on those trends without necessarily citing old literature would be to look at literature reviews, because other literature reviews would have already cited the most primitive, the very old literature to pick up on early developments. Jobile?
Thank you, I'm covered, Doc. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Colleagues, we've come to the end of our session. I am aware that we don't have any other questions. Otherwise, if there is any question, I can give you a second. Thank you very much, Prof Ngobese, for this very informative session. And please, I can see there's one more hand here. Make sure that you share your email address here so that we can share the information. Okay, the hand is dropped. Thank you so much. I would like to confirm that the hand that was coming up is dropped now. And if that's the case, I would like us to conclude this meeting. And thank you so much, colleagues, for also joining this session and making it a success. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Dr. Miya, and thank you to all colleagues. Have a lovely afternoon.